If you find yourself craving more paranormal mysteries throughout the week, Midweek Mysteries is a new segment of the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast that we created in order to give you a little extra content in the middle of your week. While not a full-length episode, Midweek Mysteries is more of a curated selection of one or two short stories that we think you'll enjoy. Think of it as just a small taste of what you'll get in Sunday's episode. It's just our way of saying thank you for being a listener. With that said, let's start the show. Welcome to Midweek Mysteries, and thank you for being here. I am your host, Nick Ryan. I'd like to start the show by saying a huge thank you to our wonderful patrons. Your support and generosity is truly amazing, and it makes our podcast possible. As always, we enjoy giving a personal shout-out to all of our supporters at the beginning of our full-length episodes every Sunday, so if you're a patron, be sure to tune in. Today's first Midweek Mystery comes to us from Chuck. Chuck calls their story, Almost Possessed. Chuck says, "Hey Nick, like most sophomores in high school, I was trying to figure out who I was. I started listening to music from the late 60s, and I really got into it. I call these my hippie years. However, they didn't involve drugs, just good music and an easygoing vibe. I still dressed normal for the early 90s though. I did, however, start to acquire peace symbols. I bought a couple from the mall and one from a friend. I made them all into one necklace that I wore daily. It's even in my sophomore yearbook picture. When I first put the necklace together, everything seemed fine. After a few months, though, a couple of weird things started to happen. I came home from school one day to my mother's best friend being over to visit. This wasn't out of the norm because they were quite close. Her friend is what I would have then called a Jesus freak. I always loved God and have believed in Jesus my whole life, but she took it to the next level. As soon as she saw me, she said, "Chuck, when you walked through the door, God told me I needed to talk to you. I didn't know what about until now." She looked at my necklace and said, "There's a problem with those peace symbols, and you need to get rid of them. Not just throw them away, but cut them up." I was pissed. I had mowed grass and did chores to pay for them. How dare she tell me to get rid of them? She then said that there was something attaching itself to me because of them. I shook my head in total disbelief. She then told me that the peace symbol is an old symbol meant to be an upside-down broken cross, mocking the cross that Jesus died on. I told her that I didn't care about that, and that it meant peace to me, and she couldn't change my mind about that. She then asked if anything strange had happened in the last couple of months. She had my attention then, because there had been strange things happening while I slept. As a child, I was always scared to sleep by myself. When I woke in the middle of the night, I always looked at the door to see if anything was there, every time. One night that year, I rolled over and there was a lady standing there. She was wearing a Victorian dress and holding a baby. She was transparent but totally calming. This was the first and only time I'd seen her, but I felt totally at ease. She slowly walked toward my bed and then disappeared. I fell back to sleep and never worried about seeing her again. A couple weeks later, it was a completely different experience. I was asleep in my room and was awoken and completely scared. My heart was racing like I had been sprinting, and I shot up in bed. It was about midnight, and my room was bright, like I had the light on. It was actually getting brighter by the second, like a spotlight was walking down the hallway into my room. As it did, the amount of dread and evil I felt increased with every second. I said a prayer. "In the name of Jesus, I command you to leave my room." It left, not like someone turned off the light switch, but it left, like the light left the room. I had a hard time getting back to sleep that night, and a few nights after that. Then one morning, my mom tells me how weird I was being the night before. I had no idea what she was talking about. She says I came into her room about midnight and woke her up, insisting that she come to bed with me because I was scared. Remember, I was 16. She followed me to my room, and she watched me lay down and go right back to sleep. She said she stayed for a minute and went back to her bed. As I told these stories, my mother broke down and started sobbing, saying that every morning she says a prayer of protection over me, hoping to keep me safe. At that point, I was still upset at the thought of cutting the peace symbols up and destroying them, but I went to the garage to get some aviation snips to do just that, in order to make my mother happy. As I was cutting them up, I felt nothing strange at all, until I made the last cut. When I made the last cut, I felt a heaviness leave my body. It was like I'd been weighed down, and I didn't even know it. The room felt lighter, and before I set the snips on the table, I blew up into tears. I know how this sounds. It's crazy. This really happened to me, and still gives me the chills, almost 30 years later. I know that not everyone has the same beliefs as me, and that's okay. I just know that without God's intervention, through my mother's friend, I'm not sure where I'd be today. Our next midweek mystery comes from Kathleen. Kathleen calls her story, The Shaking Mirror. Kathleen says, I was a college student going to the University of North Texas in Denton. Student housing being what it was, I found a cheap tiny duplex on Hickory Street, 2 blocks from campus, and it was not anything fancy. It had been built on pier and beam blocks, consisting of a living room, bathroom, and a kitchen on the first floor, and a tiny loft bedroom upstairs. One night, due to circumstances, an acquaintance of mine had spent the night with me. She was a very interesting young woman, and we started telling stories about our childhoods. We were sitting in the living room talking. She had grown up in Georgia, out in the countryside, outside of Albany. As a child, there was always poltergeist activity in her house. Her parents believed it was her throwing ashtrays, cups, and plates, and so forth. Some items had been located well out of her reach as a child, and yet she was still blamed for their destruction. The night wore on, and our stories moved from creatures living in the woods with shining red eyes and ghosts in the attic to something one night that walked up to the back door, only to then drop down on all fours and run away. It was getting late, well after 1 a.m, when suddenly, my large wood-framed mirror hanging on my wall began shaking. I had found it in a closet months earlier. I guess a previous renter had left it behind. It was very heavy, measuring 24 inches by 36 inches. The frame was ancient, its finish was cracked and worn, and the beveled mirror itself had worn spots where the silver had pulled away from the glass. There was a thick hank of rope nailed to the back that I used to hang it on the wall. The mirror was shaking and making an incredible amount of noise. We stopped talking and sat completely still for a couple of minutes. The mirror continued to shake. I was both scared and intrigued. This had never happened to me before. My friend took it in stride. I got up and walked to the mirror. It continued shaking, bouncing on the wall. I placed my hand on the wall as close to the mirror as I could, making sure not to touch it. The wall was not shaking. There wasn't any sensation of movement on the wall at all. It was the mirror, just the mirror. I went outside to see if there was maybe something hitting the outside, say a tree branch being blown against the house. There was nothing causing the shaking. I grew up watching such scary TV shows like The Twilight Zone, The Outer Limits, and Night Gallery. Those shows taught you not to touch weird objects, because you could find yourself in another dimension or universe. So, with a bit of trepidation, I placed my palm of my hand squarely in the middle of the mirror. I felt nothing, and it stopped shaking. After a few seconds, maybe 10 or 15, I removed my hand and stepped back. Slowly, it started again. Just a light tapping at first, and then it grew in intensity. In less than a minute, it was bouncing hard against the wall. The hair stood up on the back of my neck. Whatever it was still there. This went on for 20 minutes. We decided to change the subject of our discussion. No more stories of witchcraft, of red glowing eyes staring down from high tree limbs, of ghosts, the Illuminati, and spectral images. The mirror stopped shaking about 10 minutes later. Later that week, I placed the mirror at the curb for trash pickup. It was gone in less than an hour. Someone had picked it up, and now has that mirror hanging on their wall. Now it's their problem. As we come to the end of this edition of Midweek Mysteries, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for listening and supporting the podcast, and a special thank you to Chuck and Kathleen for writing in and sharing their experiences with all of us. Until next time, I hope you all have a safe and healthy rest of the week, and we'll see you back here on Sunday for our next episode. If you believe that you or someone that you know has witnessed something unexplainable, and you'd like to have your story shared on the podcast, you can contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com or visit paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. All of our contact information, as well as the sources that were referenced for today's episode, can be found in the show notes. You can also get involved with the podcast by joining our forum and by following us on social media. If you're on Facebook or Instagram, you can find us at Paranormal Mysteries Podcast or on Twitter at ParaMysteryPod. And while you're there, please give us a follow. If you're wondering how you can support the show, you're supporting it right now just by listening, and we appreciate it. You can also help by subscribing to the podcast and sharing it with your friends. If you're looking for additional ways to show your support, you can visit patreon.com/Paranormal Mysteries and become a patron. Benefits include ad-free episodes and early access to select shows. New episodes of the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast are produced every Sunday, with a new Midweek Mysteries available every Wednesday, and they are available on all of your favorite podcast apps, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher. From all of us at the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast, thank you so much for listening, and remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.